Hi, I'm Alex Drummond, Executive Editor for Metro Magazine, and welcome back to METROspectives. Today, my guest is Mark Aesch, CEO of TransPro Consulting. Today, Mark joins me to discuss his longtime partnership with Metro Magazine, innovation in the public transit industry, his Raise the Mark Foundation, and much more. If you know Mark, you know it's a great conversation. If you're not familiar with him, I hope you enjoy. Thanks. But great. Thanks for joining me, Mark. I appreciate you taking the time. How's things going today?
Going great. Really, always a joy to connect, and I think you continue the tradition of making this the place to gather and have interesting dialogue. So glad to be a part of it.
Great. Yeah. And interesting you say that because you are part of the team that's putting together interesting dialogue on metromagazine.com. Can you talk a little bit about the blog you've been doing for us and kind of, what were the goals of that blog when it began?
We've had such a long-standing relationship. I would call it a partnership, that's gone back years now. And I think as I watched the industry going through COVID and so many people essentially having the same conversation, I was hearing from more and more clients of wanting to have a different conversation. How do we think about topics in a different way? How do we challenge sort of the group think, of the way so many industries tend to work? And I wanted to create a place where people who wanted to have a different conversation could have it. And you've been gracious enough to create the platform for that. And it's been terrific, to get ourselves up and running. And I think to be having a different conversation that ridership isn't, the only metric of success, that we think about things in a different way, that electric buses aren't necessarily the answer for the industry. It's how do we think about, value and the delivery of value in a different fashion. So appreciate the partnership and glad to be able to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we appreciate it too. And I'm interested about that conversation because, what kind of things are you hoping to tackle a little bit more of that people have reached out to you or that you've heard of, from people at shows and things like that?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting discussion taking place over a couple of factors. One, I would say leadership itself. I'm watching so many agencies really invest in how people think about thinking, really helping their team members and even themselves, the vulnerability of some executives to say, I need to inspire myself and those who are closest around me to think about the things that we think about. And we're like having a ton of fun, working with agencies that are leading in that regard. I would say a second that, I really see happening pretty significantly is this age-old discussion of like, we have to go buy another 40-foot bus. And, I think innovative agencies are recognizing that their responsibility is to provide mobility to people. And that may mean that we don't have buses. It may mean that we provide a technology hub where people are able to come together and we broker rides on a number of different providers, potentially none of which we own, right? They may not even be ours. We simply, provide that opportunity for people. And then I would say the third is this recognition of being able to tell the industry's story about value, measurable value, beyond simply like how many people are you moving. And I think the agencies that are recognizing this ongoing discussion of, quote, ridership recovery is not really the day of celebration. It's indicating that your community sees value from what you do, and you've been able to lead your agency to be able to provide that. So I would say those are the three spaces that I really see agencies having unconventional conversation around.
But great. And then, sort of, from an innovation standpoint, I think, we're at a point where transit is innovating much quicker, much more nimble in the way it's innovating. Can you talk about, what are some of the factors going into that? Has it been an acceptance of a technology? Has it been just kind of the idea of, um, looking at things differently, approaching different approaches?
So I would say a couple of factors. The first is, we've heard this term bandied about of, a quote unquote fiscal cliff. And the reality is every organization that exists faces a fiscal cliff, right? If people stop buying Apple iPhones, right, Apple will face a fiscal cliff. If people stop buying donuts, Dunkin' Donuts faces a fiscal cliff. And so agile organizations reinvent themselves so that they don't hit the cliff, right? You want to avoid the cliff. And I think just the concept that we're headed for a fiscal cliff is nonsensical because you adapt and you reinvent yourself so that you don't find the cliff. And I think to the core of your question, right, I think innovative agencies are recognizing because of the economics that we face, because of the necessity to bring value to the community, because of the need to enhance the quality of a customer experience, we have to think about things in a different way. Like I'll give a good example. APTA has had this marketing and communication workshop for years, conference that they hold. They've added customer experience to the title of that. I mean, that's the cornerstone of what we do, is provide customer experience. And so I think you're seeing both the industry and individual agencies recognize the core purpose of what it is that we do is provide a high quality experience to people.
Mhm.
It's to make sure that the taxpayer who's funding it sees measurable value, and the necessity to change how we provide service is driven by the fact that the economics are limited. And much like McDonald's years ago used to sell pasta, and they realized like that didn't work too well. You have to adapt and provide what the marketplace wants to buy.
Yeah. And in terms of customer experience, one of the things I remember you wrote the introduction kind of blog and talking about what you plan on talking about. And then, it was the follow-up blog a couple down the road, but it was New York MTA is, their satisfaction scores are higher. Why didn't I know that? Why don't you know that? Why doesn't anybody know that? How important is it to kind of knowledge share, and what are some ways that transit agencies can and are, sharing that knowledge across the industry?
Yeah, so I mean, what Rich Davey and his team in New York have done is just phenomenal, right? I mean, the significance and the scope of what takes place in New York just dwarfs the rest of the country. And to watch the story of success that they brought by really focusing on quality of customer experience, building the right teams, having a very different, set of meetings that are focused on both key performance indicators and key experience indicators, really putting the customer in the driver's seat to empower the customer and get right what was most important to them. It's the reason that I wrote, the column that I did, which is, I mean, from my perspective, they should be telling the New York City transit story at every gathering of the industry to see, like, it's totally possible. Like, why aren't we all doing this? Because I think it is such a fantastic story of success. And it's not that hard, right? I mean, Rich would tell you, I mean, there's a lot of pushing the snowball up the hill, but by focusing on the right elements and really driving behavior change within the agency, they've pulled off something, that's magical, in New York. I think we could easily replicate precisely those kinds of stories, but I think much like this dialogue that you and I are having, and the reason, that we do the blog together, is the necessity of having those kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Simply doing projects, is not the goal. It's thinking about the performance of the organization. Are we picking the right projects that will actually improve the performance of the organization? Cutting the ribbon, on new buses or a new station, that's not victory. Happier customers is the victory.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we create the spaces? And I think you and I having this dialogue is part of it, where we're talking about a different set of conversations, not just what electric bus are we going to buy, right? That we're really thinking about value to customer, value to the community, return to the taxpayer for the investment that they make, having that conversation. And what, the joy that I take from this is there clearly is a segment of the industry that is having that conversation and really thinking about how do I bring greater value to my customers and community.
Right. And you brought up, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself because I have a couple of follow-ups, but I think the first one is sort of the idea of ridership and the idea of showing how important public transit is to the communities they serve. And the idea of ridership kind of being the end-all be-all marker. Do you have any thoughts on how to break away from that, or how to play up some of these things like the customer experience going up, like customer satisfaction going up, people saying that they're getting benefits out of public transportation? Can that start to outweigh just sheer volume?
Yeah, and I would say that we're seeing that happen. As you know, we have a national platform, TransDash, where agencies that are committed to measurably providing value beyond simply, counting ridership, agencies like, TriMet in Portland and RTD in Denver, the RTA in Cleveland, I could run down a whole host of others, are on this platform really leading the conversation to move from simply, what's your ridership, to really thinking about value. I would say, to the core of your question, I think the reason that the industry has historically relied on this concept of ridership as the metric of success is it's really the only metric that's been nationalized, counting how many people walk through the front door. And I think where we're trying to inspire the industry to go, and agencies like this and others, like these and others, are beginning to think about, how do we nationalize customer satisfaction? Like, shouldn't we know which agency has the highest customer satisfaction in the country? Like, we should know that. And so I can tell you on TransDash, which agency does have the highest customer satisfaction. And I can tell you on TransDash, which are the top 3 metrics that you have to get right to be able to make a transit customer happy. And so I think the good news is, right, there's a group of agencies that are really wanting to lead this discussion and move into a different way. And I think about executives like Deborah Johnson, in Denver. It's an amazing story that 6% of the people who live in Denver use the public transportation system, but 86% of people who live in Denver indicate that they see value from the public transportation system. And here's the remarkable part: 36%, 6 times more than use it, indicate that they see personal value in the public transportation system. I don't use it, but 6 times more than actually use it indicate personal value. And I think what that means is, it's no different than a Starbucks relationship. I'm not going to come in and use that product that you've got, but because of that product, it allows there to be a flower shop next door to the coffee shop. It allows there to be a frame shop across the street. There's a bank around the corner. I can take advantage of all of these things. And I think that's the indication. So Deborah Johnson in Denver can tell that story, that she moves a relatively modest number of people, but an overwhelming number of people see value from the service that she delivers.
Yeah. And it's something I don't get into very often here. I think it's keeping the kind of the personal and the company line, or the magazine line. But I think it's the idea of ridership and the mainstream media story. This is something that if the media's got an axe to grind with the transit agency, they're pointing out, oh, they're only, they're running empty buses. They got 60% of their ridership back, that sort of thing. How can these sort of ideas that we're talking about here translate into, into those numbers? How can we start introducing customer satisfaction in the conversation, for instance, rather than, ridership, and try to get something, a little bit of a spin back, to say, here's something that's tangible, other than, being able to say, 50% of people have come back to transit at this point.
Yeah. I mean, you're in the business of, communicating ideas on a broadly read platform. So you'll get the concept of what I'm about to say, which is it requires the skill of the executive to be able to push back on the narrative of the question, right? So when Senator, Huzamafich or, reporter, Janice asks the question of how do you defend the fact that you're only moving 74% of the people, that you used to, like, why is your ridership so low? It starts with rejecting the premise of the question, right? That's not how we define success. Like, let me talk to you about how we do define success and go into the story. John Lewis, who was the CEO in Charlotte for a number of years, and he's on our team now, he says this so much better than I, that you don't spend $2.5 billion on a rail line to move 50,000 people a day, right? That doesn't make any sense. So if you shouldn't judge the success of a multi-billion-dollar project in regards to the number of people that you move, you do so because of the ancillary development that it spins off in the community, right? That the new mall, goes in and the new apartment building gets built and the new set of that's the reason you make that investment. And until we stop, suggesting that only 50,000 people are using it or, whatever the metric is going to be, and really begin to talk about the story of value. And I don't mean storytelling, right? Now you want to make it come alive in telling a story, but you don't get to cherry pick, the metrics of success. It's indicating that we are going to cause A, B, and C to occur. And that's how we measure, value around here. And I think that's the beauty of the TransDash platform, quite honestly, is it's the recognition that not every community defines value in the same way, that Syracuse and Sacramento are going to define what they value in a different fashion. Why should they measure the same things, right? That you measure what matters to bring value to your community. And on our platform, people are able to measure what matters to them, but they put a stake in the ground in regards to the outcomes that they're going to be able to produce.
Yeah. And so I think looking at something you mentioned earlier as kind of tying in transit to different modes that aren't necessarily owned by the transit agency. They're partnerships, talking AVs, bikes, scooters, rideshare, TNCs, that sort of thing. How do you think that the industry could start to kind of discuss the success of building multimodal models to get to where you need to go? How can they tell that story a little bit better, both in the communities of getting people onto transit and realizing it can be a tool to, their journey, and also kind of to the mainstream media and repainting the idea of transit as being a service for the poor. How can you kind of talk about how it's a tool, of a multimodal kind of idea of getting around town without a vehicle?
I'd say a couple of things, and I'll try to share a couple of examples. Steve Bland, who's the CEO in Nashville, comes immediately to mind with the recognition, the change in mindset that it doesn't have to be his bus in order for him to provide value to the community and providing transportation to people. So they have a number of partnerships with private firms that provide transportation and provide, optionality. I'm looking for a phone here, right? That provides optionality to the customer to be able to determine that marriage between time and money, right? That it may be inexpensive, but longer to be able to take a fixed route bus, but we have these other options, or you can partner with a bike, and the like. I think the other thing that jumps out at me is I think about Carm Bazile, who's the CEO of the transit system in Albany. They were just named the Change Maker of the Year company by the local Chamber of Commerce. I mean, think of that. A public transportation system being named the change maker, right? That it's having that different of a conversation of really trying to think about value in a different way. And here's an amazing part. This is in Albany, right? Upstate New York, where
Mhm.
population is declining. Their ridership level is actually higher than pre-COVID. That
Right.
because they're thinking about quality of experience, because they're thinking about how do we bring optionality to people, they're actually achieving at the yesterday's metric of success of ridership because they've designed something that people really want. And I think that's the discussion that we're watching many have, that ridership is a lagging indicator. It's not a leading indicator.
Hmm.
Provide something of value, and people will be knocking down your door to be able to come in and buy, what it is that we sell, which in our case is transportation.
Yeah. And it's easy to beat up, metropolitan areas where commuting was played such a big role. That not coming back, but there are success stories like CDTA, GRTC out in Virginia. Even in some of these metropolitan areas. I mean, we just talked about San Diego MTS growing its rail. Much different than the rest of the industry where, buses bouncing back, their rail system is boosting. So there's a lot of success stories and stories like that to be told. I mean, do you feel transit agencies are doing the best job of getting their stories out there?
I think some are. I think a part of it is that challenging the premise of the question, right?
Hmm.
That because we have embraced and allowed ridership to be the metric of success, we're routinely asked the question, like, we even do it at conferences to ourselves, like, how's your ridership? How's your ridership? Like, how's the quality of your customer experience? Like, let's ask that question. And I think, as we begin to try to ask a different set of questions, it allows us to push back on our questioners, of like, we're giving you all this money, like, what are you doing with it? And if the question is just, we're moving 82% of the same number of the people that we used to provide, like, that's not an answer that's gonna hunt very well. So, I think it's having the skills to challenge the premise of the question, to not have all of these, ridership recovery, emails and panels, and, let's actually talk to ourselves in a different way, and begin to lead people that are not in the industry to ask us the question that we wish that they would ask. Why do you think it is that only 5% of people use your service, but 85% see value in it? Like, why do you think that is, right? Like, that's the discussion we want to have.
Great. Yeah. Thanks again for joining me. I think I have a couple more things for you. I think, going back and maybe the last question on this is identifying those key factors. How do you work to identify what is important to a specific area? Obviously, customer satisfaction, that sort of thing. We're talking questionnaires, outreach meetings, that sort of thing. But how can a transit agency really identify what is specific to them in order to measure or to ask those questions?
So we do a lot of that work working with agencies on measuring both customer satisfaction and measuring community value. On the first, we'll often get asked, like, what do you think we should measure to improve customer satisfaction? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, we have to go talk to your customers, right? What matters to them? And it's interesting because we're watching a number of changes, particularly post-COVID. So, for example, nationally, the traditional transit customer is 14% less wealthy today than they were pre-COVID. Not even adjusting for inflation, just 14%, less income than pre-COVID. And you won't be surprised that fare price has skyrocketed as a factor that's important to customers because they have less resources, right? They don't have the ability to pay. And so I think one of the things that wise agencies are recognizing is the ability to raise fares for economic purposes is really diminished because it's going to have a direct head-on collision with customer satisfaction because that's risen to be so high. Similarly, on the community value side, the process we follow is we actually do a statistically valid survey of the community and understand what's important to them. And then the agency, to your point, of communication, can really think through designing a strategy to demonstrate that they're bringing value on the things that matter most in the community. A good example is Toledo, where they succeeded in a ballot proposition a few years ago, and they're really redesigning their strategy to ensure that when they face the voters for a renewal, several years out now, that the community sees a higher level of value than they did prior, because the voters chose to make an investment. Like we want to give you more money to make it better and to offer more of what it is that you do. But how can they tell the story of making sure that the community says, like, you asked us to do this and you were right. You were able to deliver, a measurable level of value. And so agencies across the country, San Antonio, others, are really thinking about that question of measurable value.
Yeah. And looking at future blogs, perhaps, what kind of conversations do you feel that need to be had out in the transit industry that maybe aren't being heard so much or being had so much?
I think, I want to continue to have the conversation of challenging ourselves, from the traditional questions that we ask ourselves, how to ridership, and really thinking through a set of questions that indicate that the industry and individual agencies, really are bringing measurable value. And I think a big part of that, one of the things that I want to spend more time on are the elements of a successful executive and how they're really thinking through how to lead their organization to a new destination. And so what are the skills and the muscle that they need to develop to be able to bring, greatest value and provide a legacy for themselves as they think that through? How do they build a team around them that is willing to think about the way that they think? To allow you to ultimately be successful. I think there's a ton on communication, right? That you really think through how to challenge the premise of a traditional question. I just wrote a piece, with you all talking about traditional transit versus modernized transit,
Right.
and really thinking about those topics in a different way. That instead of talking about state of good repair, we think about the quality of the customer experience, right? That the purpose of a healthy bus is to go take somebody to work. And so how do we have that second part of the conversation every bit as loudly as we have the first part?
Right. Great. I have a few more minutes, and I would be remiss to we've talked about a little bit on our website and the Raise Mark Foundation that you put together with Ray Malidi, that you guys are now, I believe, in your third year coming up. Can you talk a little bit about the foundation and kind of what your goal is?
Yeah, I mean, it's something Ray and I, are just so proud of, that we've been able to put that together. And the industry has just been so generous in both economically, but really in, I would say, kindness of honoring our first several honorees that we've had each year. You can see this year we're taking the approach of really reaching out to the industry and asking for nominees. The first couple of years we landed on pretty logical answers as to who we should recognize. I think one of the things that we're trying to do a little different, with the foundation this year and for going forward is sort of little mini friend raisers, if you will. So we're going to host kind of a modest golf tournament around the mobility conference that APTA will host in Portland. And we're going to raise a little bit of money at that, largely so we can keep our name loud, right? That we're not doing simply one event a year. We're having kind of a regular interaction. But the other reason is if we can raise a little bit of money at these sort of friend raiser events, we can offset the administrative costs of the foundation. It costs money to have a website, and it costs money to put on a golf tournament, and it costs money for insurance. All those things cost money. If we can raise a little bit of money through these friend raisers, then everything we raise at our big events that we do at the APTA annual conference can go towards the honoree. And so it allows even more of those resources to go towards, the generosity that everyone's providing.
Right. Great. And you guys have opened the process. We had a story earlier this month in March that you guys are opening the process for your new honoree. So can you talk a little bit about that process and what sort of people you might want to people out there might want to suggest?
Yeah. So, the first year we were able to support someone who had Lou Gehrig's disease and has since passed away. Um, Last year, we were able to support Lauren, and you were all so generous in doing a number of news stories and helping to raise the visibility of that event. Lauren, who is working her way through breast cancer. And I think our hope for this year is that the industry, both private sector and agencies themselves, will go to the website, go to the Raise the Mark Foundation.com website, and there's a place there you can literally click on the button to submit an honoree for consideration. And our hope is that we'll receive a number of really appropriate nominations, and then Ray and I will go through those and settle on, the story where we think we could bring the greatest value, and come back to people like you all and begin to tell the story of that person and really try to ramp up fundraising for the APTA conference in Anaheim and be really helpful to someone.
Great. Thanks for your time. Again, raisethemarkfoundation.com, right?
Yep, exactly right.
Great. Thanks for your time, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Hey, a pleasure. Great to see you.
Good to see you.